Hi, welcome to Cambria's Corner. My
Yes.
name is
To die, yes. Hey, y'all. Welcome to Cambria's Corner Zoom edition. I have my dear friend Marisa here with me.
my name is
Yes.
Marisa. I'm Cambria's less well-spoken friend.
We're both history and political science and honors people, and so we just happen to be in like every single class together. First of all, we did a video on her channel that you should go check out.
My is 2 a.m. reader, one word.
Go watch the video. I'll put it in the description too.
Yeah.
Okay, so today we're going to be doing a book review of some of our favorite books that we have read in some of our classes together. So I will go ahead and kick us off with a book that is on both of our lists. It is Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi, which I do not have a hard copy of. So there she is.
Wait, I have the...
So Between the World and Me, we read this for our class Modernity with Dr. Cheney this past year. It is a super insightful book on race relations in the United States. Basically, he is writing this from the perspective of him writing a letter to his son about what it means to be Black in America. And he doesn't heavily use the word race either. He kind of talks about being like his body and how this is something that has been created and how the American dream isn't something that includes every single person, but instead can be marginalizing and othering for different groups. And so especially with all the like racial uprisings going on right now and the moves for racial justice, I highly recommend this book.
Yeah, no, I agree. That one's on my list as well. It was first off just beautifully written. Like Coates is just a fantastic writer, and anything he writes, you should read. And I agree. It's like, I think such an important look into what living in America is for someone of color. And it's hard to read because we don't want to think that life could be this hard for someone because of the color of their skin, but it is. And I think him tackling a lot of those concepts, like the American dream, like Cambria mentioned, and how that is something that was basically created for white people and white people only. And also a lot of these like kind of preconceived notions of like when it comes to like education and even tackling some like poverty in neighborhoods or like the idea of the ghetto or anything like that, like really tackling like how those things are perceived and a lot of the like contradictions and just harsh realities that nobody really likes to face. And yeah, it's wonderful. It's an easy read. It's short. I think everyone should read it, and I think it will give them like such a better understanding of what life is like for people of color.
Yes, very well said. So the next book on my list is a book called More Than Good Intentions by Karlan and Appel, and basically talking about the economics of foreign aid and how oftentimes it's very easy to go into development situations and kind of have like these really good intentions to be like, okay, like we're going to save these people, we're going to implement this really great aid that's going to help them, but not necessarily stepping back and asking, okay, like what can we do for you? And like what is actually the best approach for you? Not necessarily the best approach that we think, because a lot of times people go in and think they know best, but don't necessarily know best. So this book really, just the title, More Than Good Intentions, talks about how it is more than good intentions to do good. You have to really go above and beyond that and evaluate and implement systems that are going to be long lasting and sustainable, and not just there to kind of like check mark off your goal list, but rather check mark off their goals and really just meet people where they're at in development.
Oh man, I never knew what that book was about. Now I really want to read it.
It's good.
So in my version of that class, we read this book called Misreading Scripture with Western Eyes by E. Randolph Richards and Brandon O'Brien. I thought this book was excellent. There were so many times I was reading it that I just had to stop and be like, this is saying all the things I have always wanted to say but didn't know how to say when it comes to the Christian faith. So this book, basically, it's exactly what the little subtitle thing says. Basically, it's removing cultural blinders to better understand the Bible. And that's exactly what they do, is they take a lot of the common kind of controversial topics when it comes to the Christian faith, like relationships, individualism, race, language, like all of those things that are kind of debated. And they do a really good job of not like just shoving their own opinion and just instead looking at, this is what the Bible says, this is what it meant in that culture and in that historical time. And this is how over time our culture has kind of taken those ideas and made it to mean something that maybe isn't what it was supposed to say, but they do so in a way that isn't like trying to change what the Bible said to like force their own opinion. They're just kind of like saying it as it is, but leaving you to be able to kind of like do what you will with that information. But I thought they just did such an excellent job of like really methodically looking at a lot of the areas that I think it is really easy to kind of misunderstand some of the core ideas of what the Bible is saying, because our culture is just so different and our culture has changed so much over time. And it was a really like engaging and easy read. So I like really wish everyone could read this because I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, we actually read a few sections of that book, and I just remember how much it stuck out. The section on Chronos versus Kairos, and how like in American culture we're very stuck on like, okay, this is like we're meeting at this time, very punctual, we revolve around our calendars and our planners, and kind of just the idea of like Kairos time, which is like not necessarily a set time, but just kind of like when it feels right and like when the timing is right. It's kind of more of a pivotal moment. So yes, also a good read. My next book recommendation is also from the class Modernity that we took together with Dr. Cheney. And this one is called Black Skin, White Mask, Frantz Fanon. And we read a couple excerpts from that book, but something that really stuck out to me. So basically he was writing, I believe it was in either the early 1900s or like the 1950s. And it was post-colonialism, post-imperialism, but it was a formerly French colony. And I want to say like maybe the Caribbean.
Yeah, I think it was Caribbean.
But basically talking about that, like, yes, while colonialism was over, there were still so many like scientific and social implications of race. He talks a lot about the fact that science was used against him and his other people. And also one of the biggest themes of the book actually was speech. And like whoever speaks the right way or has the right knowledge is therefore higher in society and has the right body. Like it's kind of this weird correlation between no matter how, like, because he's a very educated man, he was still looked down upon within his society because even though he learned the French language, adopted French culture, it was his body and the fact that he was Black that really just had that barrier. So it's really interesting, especially looking in tangent with like America, what was going on at that time, like the civil rights era, and then just the fact that post-colonialism had a lot of like heavy implications on race. Again, I highly recommend that book. Some great excerpts from there that we read, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's an extremely relevant conversation, especially the part about language. It actually made me think we're both doing a mentorship right now with Insight Collaborative, shout out. And this week's topic is actually on language. And I was watching the webinar this morning and they're actually talking about, well, it made me start to think about how like in America, we like so often look down at other people based off of the language that they speak, how like there's such a common problem of like thinking that if you don't speak English, then you're not like properly integrated into society, or, you know, why don't people who don't speak English like just learn the language? But then when people do, then sometimes their pronunciation isn't right or their heavy accents. And then it just gets like, people get so annoyed and frustrated. I don't know, it was something I was thinking about today. So that made me think of it, of just like how relevant that is even today with the idea of language and how much that can interact with discrimination, even without us maybe realizing it. Oh, I guess it's my turn now. Okay, so we'll talk about a book we also read in another honors class. Honors is great. So this was in You Found 1000 with Dr. Koskela. It was all in the Christian faith, and Dr. Koskela, I think, did a really great job of basically making it like, hey, if you're not Christian, you know nothing about Christianity, you're going to learn about the religion here, and if you are Christian, you're going to learn more about the religion, which I really enjoyed. So this book was on the Incarnation by Saint Athanasius. Really small book, and you know, it's old and so a lot of it can be a little repetitive but I really enjoyed this because I think it answered a lot of the questions about the death of Jesus Christ on the cross and the incarnation and the resurrection that like I always had but never really thought about that much, if that makes sense. But he really like just breaks down questions like, why did Jesus die on the cross? Like, why did he die a public death? Why was he incarnated? Like, why did he kind of like go back on what he originally said, like when he made man? Like all those nitty gritty, and kind of taking all of those counter arguments that someone might say to that and answering it. And I think it was just like so excellently written and like in really small chunks that I finished it and was like, wow, why do I feel like I understand this religion so much more than I did like before reading this book? So this is definitely like a book that I'm like very grateful that I read in that class. So
Yeah, I remember reading that too, and such an amazing understanding of what it means to be Christian, not only from the Christian perspective, but also from like the outside lens for someone who's just genuinely wanting to learn more about the religion. So my next book is one that we both read for one of Dr. Hughes's class. So this book is Factory Girls
by Leslie T. Chang.
So basically it traces, she's a journalist, she goes to China, kind of trace the journey of these girls who are living in rural villages and then moving to the cities to go work in factories and pursue better opportunities, especially because during the era this was written, I think like the early 2000s, maybe like late 90s. So pretty recent history. There was huge like mass migration from rural areas of China to the industrial zones, the special economic zones that were put in place, and then the factories that were established there. And so it really just gives an in-depth look of what life was like for the girls working in factories, kind of like the uncertainty that was always going on, but also the sense of freedom that they felt. Yes, there are hardships, but like these are ultimately their choices, and they are powerful. They have resiliency. They're able to adapt. And so just a really empowering narrative. Also, you do see a lot of the hardships that go on. So just a really good balance of what life is actually like in China for those working in factories, especially young women.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's really well written too. So like very engaging and easy to read, which is always a plus, because I feel like that allows it to be a lot more accessible by people who maybe like aren't as fanatic about history as we are. So I think it's a book that anyone could and should pick up and just read, because I think another thing that it really does a good job at like bringing up is just how much like family relationships played a role in these girls' life. The girls were leaving to like pursue freedom and make a life of their own, but oftentimes they were also like raising this money to be able to then like send back or like help provide for their families too. So like it was these women who weren't seen as like really money makers because of the role that like sons had versus women. And so they were able to like actually go and like make a life for themselves and have that independence that in Chinese culture at the time, like they don't often have. So I think that was like a really, really interesting thing to read about as well. Oh, it's my turn again. All right, cool. So I will talk about a book that I read in a class that we didn't take together, a concept, international fiction with, yes, Dr. Anyway, so this is a book called Dogeaters by Jessica Hagedorn. I don't know. It's a terrifying cover for one. Like, I don't really know what's going on there. Like, this came in the mail and I was like, what am I reading in this class? But this book was excellent. I'd never heard of it. Most of the other books you'd read, I'd at least heard of, but I had no idea what this book was. It's set in the Philippines during the late period of their dictatorship. And the reason I really like this book is because it is very ugly. It is a very ugly historical time, especially in the Philippines, and it does not hold back any punches. Like it follows the lives of a bunch of different characters, all these different characters who are in such ugly situations, and it really just explores how raw and gritty and hard this time was, and little bits of beauty out of it as well. But it wasn't like a story that was all like, but it was all okay in the end because the world is beautiful. It was like, no, this time really sucked, and having a dictator was not good for them. And it also was really interesting because it was a really good image into how American culture had such an influence on a place like the Philippines, even though they weren't really there or doing anything. But it just showed again that like because of globalization and because of that, like America had such a presence and I want to say like smothering and just such an influence in like culture in other like countries. And I think that was just like fascinating as well to see that contrast of things that we like associate with American culture and like wealth, but then to see it amidst like an extremely hard and sometimes really ugly time in Philippines history. So really enjoyed that guy.
Nice. That actually reminds me a lot of a book that wasn't on my list, and it's actually not a book from a class. It is from a book club that the history department and Hindsight History Club, which I'm the president of next year, not to flex or anything, that we're doing this summer. And one of the books we're reading is called How to Hide an Empire by Daniel Imawar. I don't think I pronounced that right, but I will put the name there. But basically talking about the like U.S.'s vast territories like Puerto Rico and Cuba, and the Philippines were previously part of the U.S. territories, and the fact that we very often and brush that under the rug and don't really like to talk about that, and how we have this nice little map of the US that does not include any of those awkward territories that don't have political rights or voting rights. And so it kind of, the chapter we just read talks a lot about the war that was going on in the Philippines between the Spanish and the Americans, and how the Spanish government was kind of like, oh, actually only the US can have this land. Sorry, we can't give it to you, the Filipinos, because you're apparently less civilized than we are and the US needs to civilize you. So a little bit of a tangent, but another good read. So that brings us into my last book, which is called Slavery's Constitution by David Waldstreicher. I read this in Dr. Thomas's class for U.S. history from 1619 to 1876, basically from when European colonists came to Reconstruction and the Civil War. And this book talks about kind of the hidden implications that are in the U.S. Constitution, and how slavery is kind of very subtly written into that and reinforced through those who we often look at as the founding fathers, often give them a lot of credit for all the work they did, you know, the 4th of July. Obviously, while they had a lot to do for gaining independence for our country, this book kind of highlights those who did not gain independence in the Constitution and basically just the beginning of America. So it's a good read, extremely relevant right now with all the fights for racial justice going on that are super important, and definitely important to understand our history and that these divides have been going on for hundreds of years in our country. So yeah.
It ain't new. All right, yeah, so it brings me to my last book. This is Dante's Inferno by Dante. This particular one was translated by Robert Pinsky. It's a great name. I read this we both read this in honors freshman spring quarter Renaissance with Dr. Ambrose. Shout out, my best friend. Anyway, so we read this book. I had read this in high school, but I didn't really read it. You know, I kind of just read bits of it and was like, what the heck does any of this mean? I don't understand or care. So I'm very, very glad that I actually sat down and read it, because I really love this. I think first off, the writing is wonderful. Dante has just beautiful prose, and it's verse I don't know if anyone who hasn't read it, it's in verse, and it breaks down the many circles of hell. So very sunny topic, but it's very scary. And it is oftentimes kind of scary look at what Dante's impression and writing of hell was, but I think it was weirdly relevant in I don't know, you kind of just got to read it to understand it, but it makes you really think about sin, and also in the historical context and what good and evil looked like, and how different authors explored it and how we explore it. And yeah, it's a really engaging story, and I understand why it's a classic.
Yes, that is. I definitely am not as big of an English person, and definitely learned that through this class. Not saying that I didn't like Inferno, but definitely I was okay, this is something that challenges a lot of my preconceived notions, and definitely was a very good dive into the Renaissance era. All right, well, that is it for our book review. Thank you so much, Marisa, for joining. Again, go ahead and watch the video that I'm going to put down below of the book review we did on her channel. We have a lot more books over there.
Please, I need attention.
Thanks for watching, y'all. Bye.
Bye.